The young mother reached into her purse 3 separate times before finally admitting she didn't have enough money. She laid $18 in wrinkled bills across my workbench beside the car keys. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know the repair costs more than this." I looked at the old station wagon parked outside my garage. The transmission linkage had nearly failed. 2 brake lines needed replacing, and one worn belt had been moments away from snapping. If she'd driven another 20 miles, her 2 little boys probably would have been stranded on the shoulder of the highway. I quietly pushed the money back toward her. "You don't owe me anything today." She stared at me as though she hadn't heard correctly. "I can't accept charity. It isn't." "But," I smiled, "it's transportation." Across the street, a young woman lowered the camera she'd been pointing toward the old Bennett auto service sign. She wasn't watching the car. She was watching me. If you've ever seen quiet kindness mistaken for ordinary business, I hope you'll stay with me. The young mother slowly accepted her keys. "At least let me make payments." I shook my head. "When life settles down, help somebody else." Tears filled her eyes. "I don't even know how to thank you." "You just did." She drove away, wiping her face while 2 boys waved excitedly through the rear window. Only after the car disappeared around the corner did I pull a small black notebook from my shirt pocket. I opened to a fresh page. Carefully, I wrote, "Rachel Morales. Brake lines, transmission linkage." Then, beneath the repair details, I added one final sentence. "Pray the boys never miss another day of school." I closed the notebook and returned it to my pocket. No invoice, no balance due, just another page. The bell above the garage door rang softly. The young woman from across the street stepped inside carrying a notebook almost as worn as mine. "My name's Sarah Collins." I wiped my hands on an old shop towel. "What can I do for you?" "I'm a reporter. I don't usually make the news." She smiled politely. "You've repaired 3 cars this morning." "That's accurate." "I never saw anyone pay." I shrugged. "Not everyone can." She glanced toward the office desk. "I also didn't see you print a receipt." "I didn't." "So how do you keep track?" I looked toward the little black notebook resting safely inside my shirt pocket. "The important things get written down." She waited. I didn't explain further. Instead, I picked up another wrench. An elderly farmer pulled his pickup into the next service bay. One glance beneath the hood told me the water pump wouldn't survive another week. Sarah watched me greet him by name before he even climbed out. "You remember everyone?" "I remember their vehicles." The farmer laughed. "Don't let Walter fool you." He tipped his cap. "He remembers people first." Sarah scribbled something inside her notebook. I noticed she wasn't writing about engines anymore. She was writing about me. Late that afternoon, after the final customer had driven away, I locked the garage, balanced the day's receipts, and quietly counted the cash register. $43. Barely enough to cover tomorrow's parts delivery. I looked once more at the black notebook. There were hundreds of names inside, not $1 amount. As I switched off the garage lights, Sarah remained parked across the street with her notebook still open. Whatever story she thought she had found, it hadn't even begun yet. Sarah returned 3 days later, driving a 15-year-old sedan that rattled loudly before it even reached my garage. She climbed out, carrying the same reporter's notebook tucked beneath one arm. "I actually do need help today," she admitted. I looked toward the car. "The engine?" She smiled. "The editor says it's my driving. I'll trust the engine." She laughed. It was the first genuine laugh I'd heard from her. I opened the hood and listened quietly for less than 30 seconds. "Worn ignition coils. Serious? Serious enough to leave you stranded?" She leaned against the fender while I gathered tools. "You diagnosed that awfully fast. The Army taught me to listen before touching." She watched me loosen the first bolt. "You were a mechanic?" "Vehicle maintenance." "For how long?" "Long enough to know engines usually tell the truth before people do." She wrote that sentence into her notebook. I wasn't giving an interview. I know. I just liked the answer. An hour later, the sedan started smoothly. Sarah reached for her wallet. I accepted the money she offered. She looked surprised. "I thought you didn't charge anyone." "I charge most people." "You let that young mother leave without paying. She needed groceries more than spark plugs." Sarah studied my face carefully. "So there are rules. There are people." That answer seemed to satisfy her less than it puzzled her. Before leaving, she glanced toward my shirt pocket. "The notebook again." I nodded. "You really do write something after every repair?" "I do." "What happens if someone comes back years later wanting to pay?" "They usually don't." "You don't mind?" "I didn't fix the car hoping they'd return." She closed her own notebook. "I think that's the part I don't understand." "That's all right." She started her engine. "Would you let me come back? For another repair? For another conversation?" I shrugged. The coffee's usually better than the questions. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah stopped by several mornings without bringing a camera. Sometimes she swept the waiting room while interviewing customers. Sometimes she simply watched. One elderly schoolteacher quietly hugged me after picking up her minivan. A construction worker left homemade peach preserves on the office counter instead of cash. A young couple returned 6 months after a repair, only to replace the coffee machine without leaving a note. Sarah noticed everything, especially what no one mentioned aloud. Late one afternoon, she approached me carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I've interviewed 11 customers. Busy week. Every one of them told me you helped them when life was falling apart." I tightened the final lug nut on a pickup truck. "People remember difficult seasons." They also said something strange. I looked up. "They all believe they still owe you." I smiled faintly. "They don't." "Have you ever told them that?" "Every single time." She hesitated. "Then why do they keep saying it?" Before I could answer, Rachel Morales pulled into the garage. The same station wagon looked cleaner now. The boys climbing out wore school baseball uniforms. Rachel handed me a small paper bag. "My oldest insisted you should have these." Inside were chocolate chip cookies. "No bill," she said with a smile. "But we can bake." After she left, Sarah quietly looked toward the black notebook. "You wrote something after she drove away." "I always do." "What did you write?" I slipped the notebook back into my pocket. "Nothing about money." That evening, Sarah visited the county business office while researching my garage. The clerk printed several years of public tax filings. She stared at the numbers twice, then a third time. According to every financial record, Bennett Auto Service should have closed nearly 5 years ago. Yet somehow, Every Monday morning, the garage doors still opened exactly on time. Sarah stopped trying to interview me after that. Instead, she began listening to everyone else. It turned out people talked more freely when they believed the story wasn't about themselves. One rainy Thursday morning, she arrived before I unlocked the garage. She sat inside her sedan with a paper cup of coffee, watching the first customers pull into the gravel lot. I nodded as I rolled the overhead door open. "You planning to write an article or apply for a mechanic's license?" She smiled. "I'm still deciding." The first customer that morning was a retired mail carrier named George Ellis. His pickup refused to start. While I replaced a corroded battery cable, Sarah struck up a conversation. "How long have you known Walter?" George rubbed his gray beard. "About 20 years. Always this busy?" "He never advertises." "Then how do people find him?" George laughed. "They usually arrive because life stopped working before the car did." Sarah wrote that sentence down immediately. When George drove away, he left fresh tomatoes from his garden on my workbench. No money, no receipt, just quiet gratitude. By lunchtime, Sarah had collected half a dozen stories. A school principal whose bus duty never missed a morning because Walter repaired her transmission over a weekend. A volunteer firefighter whose truck was fixed before a winter storm. A young father whose delivery van kept his small bakery alive after Walter refused payment. Every story sounded different. Every ending sounded strangely familiar. He never made me feel poor. He acted like helping was normal. He fixed the problem before asking about the money. Late that afternoon, Sarah visited Rachel Morales at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. Rachel smiled the moment Walter's name came up. "I knew this wasn't really about cars." "It isn't?" Rachel shook her head. "The transmission wasn't what saved me." "What did?" "My job." Sarah listened quietly. "If I had lost that station wagon, I would have missed probation at the hospital." She folded her hands. "I would have been fired. And your boys? They would have lost health insurance." Rachel looked toward the pediatric wing down the hallway. "Walter never repaired a transmission. He repaired our future." Sarah sat silently for several moments. That sentence felt larger than any headline she could write. Before leaving, she asked one final question. "Did he ever explain why he wouldn't let you pay?" Rachel smiled. "He said something I'll never forget." "What was it?" "The Army taught me that broken equipment is expensive. Broken hope costs even more." Sarah returned to the garage just before closing. She found me balancing invoices at the old wooden desk. Stacks of paid repair orders filled one side. The little black notebook rested alone on the other. "You actually charge plenty of customers," she observed. "I do. So why doesn't any of this make financial sense?" I looked toward the empty service bays. "Because not everything that matters fits inside bookkeeping." She hesitated. "I checked the public business records." "I'm sure you did. They say this garage should have failed years ago." "They're probably right. Then why hasn't it?" Before I could answer, the neighboring dealership owner, Frank Dawson, stepped through the office door. He wasn't smiling. "Walter," he said firmly, "the bank manager stopped by my place this morning." I looked up. "What did she want?" Frank sighed. "She wanted to know if I'd be interested in buying this property after foreclosure." Sarah's pen stopped moving. "The bank?" Frank nodded. They've scheduled a financial review. The room fell silent. For the first time since she began investigating, Sarah realized the mystery wasn't simply why Walter helped people. It was whether there would be a garage left to help anyone at all. That evening, after everyone had gone home, I opened the black notebook once more. On the final page, already waiting for tomorrow, one line had been written years ago. If the garage closes, don't let the kindness close with it. Frank Dawson remained standing in the office long after the words bank review settled into the silence. Neither of us reached for another cup of coffee. Neither of us pretended the conversation wasn't serious. Sarah quietly closed her notebook. "When is the review?" Frank answered before I could. "Next Tuesday." "That's only 6 days." He nodded. "The loan officer says unless the numbers improve, they'll begin foreclosure proceedings." Sarah looked toward me. "You knew." "I've known for months. You never told anyone." I smiled faintly. I didn't see how worrying other people would repair an engine. Frank folded his arms. "Walter, this isn't another broken alternator." "I know. They're talking about closing the garage." I looked around the old office. Every shelf held memories disguised as ordinary tools. Army maintenance manuals, coffee stains on the wooden counter, photographs of vehicles I'd rebuilt years ago. Nothing expensive, everything earned. Sarah finally asked the question she'd been carrying since the first day. "What's inside the notebook?" I rested one hand over my shirt pocket. "Hope." She frowned gently. "I don't understand." "You will." That evening, after Frank left, Sarah stayed behind to help sweep the shop floor. The work took nearly an hour. Neither of us spoke very much. When the last toolbox had been returned to its place, I unlocked the office filing cabinet and removed the small black notebook. I placed it gently on the desk. "For years," I said quietly, "people assumed this was where I kept unpaid bills." Sarah nodded. "I thought so too." I opened to the first page. Instead of numbers, she found neat handwriting. January 14th, Mrs. Evelyn Porter. Fuel pump replaced. Beneath it, another line. Pray her husband survives surgery. Sarah turned another page. March 8th, Carlos Jimenez radiator repair. Interview tomorrow. May he find steady work. Another page. August 2nd, Rachel Morales brake lines. The boys deserve peaceful mornings. She looked up slowly. There aren't any balances. No. No invoices. No. No amounts owed. I smiled. Only reasons to remember. Sarah carefully continued reading. Some entries ended with joy. Found a house today. Cancer in remission. Daughter graduated. Others carried sorrow. Still searching. Pray again. One page held only 3 simple words. Lord, strengthen him. Nothing else. Sarah's eyes filled with quiet tears. You followed them. Sometimes. For years? As long as they needed someone silently hoping things would improve. She gently closed the notebook. So every free repair became a reminder. To collect payment? I shook my head. To keep caring? The room fell silent. Finally, she asked the one question I had avoided answering since we met. Why? I looked toward the old army photograph hanging above the workbench. 30 mechanics stood beside armored recovery vehicles, most of them smiling, one face missing. When I was serving overseas, I began quietly. A young specialist named Kevin Mercer received emergency leave. Sarah listened without interrupting. His mother was dying. I swallowed carefully. The transport vehicle assigned to take him to the airfield broke down. She slowly understood. We couldn't repair it in time. The memory still carried weight after all these years. He reached home 2 hours after she passed away. Sarah lowered her eyes. I've never forgiven myself. You weren't the one who caused the breakdown. I was the maintenance chief. I rested one hand against the worn workbench. That day I realized broken machines never only affect machines. She nodded silently. They interrupt birthdays. She nodded again. They cost jobs. Another nod. They delay hospital visits. Her eyes met mine. They change lives. Exactly. I looked back toward the notebook. When I retired, I made myself one promise. What promise? If I could keep one family's life moving forward. I paused. I'd never let money stop me from trying. Sarah quietly reached across the desk and rested her hand on the notebook. You've been keeping far more than repair records. Before I could answer, the office telephone rang. Frank's voice came through almost immediately. Walter? He sounded unusually serious. The bank moved the foreclosure hearing forward. My heart sank. To when? Monday morning. We had just lost another day. And suddenly, time had become the one thing no mechanic could repair. Monday suddenly felt much closer than anyone wanted to admit. The foreclosure notice rested on my office desk beneath the little black notebook, as though two completely different definitions of value had been placed side by side. One measured dollars, the other measured lives. Neither could ignore the other any longer. Sarah returned early the next morning carrying a cardboard box. Inside were copies of every interview she had conducted during the past 3 weeks. I thought you should read them. I gently pushed the box back toward her. They're your notes. They're your story. I smiled. No. I rested one hand on the notebook. They're everyone else's. She looked around the quiet garage. Walter, you don't have to save me. I'm not trying to. She hesitated. I'm trying to save this place. I slowly shook my head. If the garage closes, another mechanic will open eventually. Not like this one. I didn't answer. Deep down, I knew she was right. Just before lunch, a young father pulled into the service bay, towing a small camper behind his pickup. His wife stepped carefully from the passenger seat, carrying a sleepy little girl wrapped in a blanket. The father looked embarrassed. I'm sorry to bother you. You aren't. Our daughter's pediatric specialist is 3 hours away. I immediately understood. The truck? Alternator. I opened the hood. The diagnosis took less than a minute. Normally, replacing it would have taken 30 minutes. That morning, my hands wouldn't cooperate. The arthritis had spread across both wrists during the night. I reached for the ratchet. It slipped from my fingers. The young father pretended not to notice. So did I. I tried again. Pain shot through both hands before I could loosen the first bolt. Sarah quietly watched from the office doorway. Without saying anything, she walked over and picked up the fallen tool. "Walter, I'm fine." She handed me the ratchet anyway. "You don't have to prove anything." I looked toward the little girl asleep inside the truck. "They need to leave today. I know." Before either of us spoke again, another voice came from behind us. "I can finish the alternator." Frank Dawson stood in the service bay wearing clean work clothes instead of his dealership jacket. I looked surprised. "You closed your shop? For an hour? You'll lose business." He smiled faintly. "I think I've misunderstood business for a long time." Without another word, Frank picked up the tools. I quietly talked him through every step. Within 40 minutes, the truck started perfectly. The young parents reached for their wallets. Frank looked toward me. I nodded once. The father slowly lowered his hand. "How much do we owe?" I smiled. "Drive safely." After they left, I sat alone on the old wooden stool beside my workbench. My hands rested quietly in my lap. For the first time since opening Bennett Auto Service, I had needed another mechanic to complete a repair. It hurt more than the arthritis. Frank sat beside me. "You know what bothers you most?" "I probably do." "You think accepting help means you've become the customer." I looked toward him. "Maybe." He laughed softly. "Then welcome to the other side of the counter." Sarah never wrote a word during that conversation. She simply watched. Late that afternoon, she visited Rachel Morales again. This time, Rachel wasn't alone. One by one, former customers kept arriving after hearing rumors about the foreclosure. A teacher, a firefighter, a delivery driver, an elderly widow, a college student. Every person told a different story, yet every story ended the same way. Walter kept my family moving. Sarah finally asked the question that had quietly grown inside her notebook. "If the bank closes the garage," she looked around the room, "who keeps helping the next family?" No one answered immediately. Then Rachel smiled through quiet determination. "I think." She looked toward everyone gathered inside the waiting room. "Maybe it's finally our turn." That evening, while locking the garage, I opened the little black notebook one more time. Instead of writing another prayer beside someone else's name, for the first time in decades, I left an entire page blank. The blank page stayed blank all weekend. For anyone else, it would have looked like an empty sheet of paper. To me, it felt like a question I no longer knew how to answer. For 31 years, I had ended every difficult repair by writing someone else's name. Now I found myself wondering whether my own story had finally reached the point where someone else needed to begin writing. Monday morning arrived colder than expected. I unlocked Bennett Auto Service before sunrise, just as I always had. The familiar smell of motor oil and old pine shelves greeted me at the door. Everything looked exactly the same. Only this time I wasn't certain how many mornings remained. Sarah pulled into the gravel lot carrying a large cardboard box. "You came early." I couldn't sleep. She lifted the box onto the office desk. Inside were photocopies. Hundreds of them. Notebook pages. Interview transcripts. Old photographs customers had mailed overnight. handwritten letters, cards, children's drawings. I looked at her. What is all this? Evidence. For the bank? For the town? Before I could ask another question, the garage bell rang. Rachel Morales walked inside. Then George Ellis, the retired school principal. The firefighter, the bakery owner. Within 15 minutes, nearly every chair in the waiting room had filled. No one had brought broken cars. They had brought stories. Rachel spoke first. You remember the notebook entry about my boys? I nodded. She smiled. They both made the honor roll this year. George stepped forward carrying an old photograph. You repaired my truck the week my wife started chemotherapy. He placed the picture beside Sarah's files. We celebrated our 40th anniversary last month. One after another, they quietly added pieces of their lives to the growing stack. Graduation announcements, wedding invitations, baby photographs, military enlistment letters, college acceptance certificates. None of them mentioned money. Every single one mentioned hope. Sarah looked toward me. You thought the notebook was yours. I remained silent. It never was. She gently rested one hand on the growing pile. It belongs to everyone whose future you quietly protected. Just then, Frank Dawson hurried through the service bay carrying a young apprentice beside him. The apprentice looked barely 20. Nervous? I asked. He nodded honestly. Frank smiled. His name's Ethan. The young man extended his hand. Sir? He looked around the garage. I've wanted to learn here since I was a kid. I laughed softly. There isn't much glamour. I'm not here for glamour. He glanced toward the black notebook. I'm here because people don't leave talking about repaired cars. He paused. They leave talking about you. I looked away. They're remembering the wrong thing. No, Ethan answered quietly. They're remembering how you made them feel. Before I could respond, the office telephone rang. It was the bank. The foreclosure hearing had been delayed 1 hour because additional community testimony had been requested. Sarah slowly smiled. They've already started listening. An hour later, just as I prepared to leave for town hall, another pickup truck rolled unexpectedly into the service bay. Inside sat a young father, his pregnant wife and an anxious little girl. Smoke drifted from beneath the hood. I'm sorry, the father said breathlessly. The hospital called. My wife's labor has become high risk. I stepped toward the truck automatically, then stopped. My hands. The pain returned immediately. I looked toward Ethan. He looked back at me. Without hesitation, I handed him my favorite wrench. Your first repair. His eyes widened. You trust me? I smiled. I trust what you're here to become. I stood beside him, guiding every movement while he replaced the failed radiator hose with steady determination. 20 minutes later, the engine purred quietly. The young family hurried toward the hospital. As they drove away, Ethan wiped grease from his hands. How much should I charge them? I reached into my pocket. The black notebook rested there as always. Slowly, I placed it into Ethan's hands. You don't start with invoices. He looked down at the worn cover. You start, I smiled, by remembering why the car mattered. For the first time in decades, I walked toward the foreclosure hearing without carrying the notebook. And somehow, it felt exactly where it belonged. By the time we reached the county courthouse, the hallway outside the hearing room was already full. I expected lawyers, bank officials, maybe a few local business owners. Instead, I found families. Teachers stood beside mechanics. Nurses talked quietly with farmers. Veterans shared coffee with young parents holding restless children. Many of the faces looked familiar. Not because I remembered their cars, because I remembered the days their lives had almost stopped moving. Sarah looked around the crowded hallway and smiled. "You thought you were coming here alone?" "I hoped I was." She laughed softly. "I don't think this town is going to let that happen." The bank's loan officer, Rebecca Sloan, stepped into the hallway carrying a thick financial file. She looked genuinely surprised. "I wasn't expecting." She glanced toward the growing crowd. "Quite this many people." Neither was I. When the hearing began, the county administrator invited everyone inside. The room filled quickly. I took a seat beside Sarah and Ethan. The little black notebook rested quietly in Ethan's lap. Not hidden, not displayed, simply present. Rebecca Sloan stood first. "The financial records are straightforward," she began. "Bennett Auto Service has operated at a loss for several consecutive years." No one argued. She continued. "The mortgage payments have fallen behind." Another uncomfortable truth. Under ordinary circumstances, foreclosure would proceed. She closed the financial folder. However, the room grew noticeably quieter. We received more than 300 letters over the weekend. Sarah looked toward me. I hadn't known. Rebecca lifted a stack of envelopes nearly 6 inches thick. "Every letter describes the same business." She paused. "But none of them describe the same mechanic." She opened the first envelope. A schoolteacher wrote that Walter repaired her minivan so she could continue transporting students after her husband passed away. The second. A firefighter explained that Walter refused payment after a wildfire destroyed his family's home. The third. A college graduate credited a repaired delivery van with helping his father keep the family business alive long enough to pay tuition. Story after story echoed across the courtroom. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, simply honest. When Rebecca finally lowered the last letter, she looked directly at me. "Mr. Bennett." "Yes?" "I've worked in banking for 23 years." She smiled gently. "I've never reviewed an asset quite like this." Before I could answer, Rachel Morales stood. "I'd like permission to speak." The administrator nodded. Rachel walked to the front carrying a small envelope. She placed it beside the financial reports. "My boys are teenagers now." She smiled proudly. "They still remember the day Walter fixed our station wagon." She looked toward me. I couldn't repay him then. She turned back toward the room. "But I can help the next family now." She opened the envelope. Inside was a cashier's check. Others quietly stood. George, the school principal, the firefighter, the bakery owner. One by one they stepped forward, not to repay old repairs, to build something new. Sarah leaned toward Ethan. "This is why Walter left the last notebook page blank." Ethan nodded slowly. It was waiting for someone else's name. Frank Dawson rose next. I own another repair shop. He looked toward the administrator. I used to think Walter's generosity hurt honest businesses. He smiled toward me. I was wrong. He reached into his briefcase. My dealership will donate labor and equipment to a permanent community repair program. The room fell completely silent. Rebecca Sloan quietly closed her financial folder. I believe this hearing has changed. The county administrator nodded. It certainly has. He looked toward the stack of letters, the growing collection of donations, and finally the black notebook resting in Ethan's hands. What began as a foreclosure review, he paused, now appears to be the beginning of something much larger. I slowly looked toward Ethan. He gently opened the notebook to its final blank page. Without saying a word, he uncapped a pen. Then he looked at me. What should I write first? For a long moment, I couldn't answer. Finally, I smiled. Don't start with a repair. He waited. I looked around the courtroom filled with people whose lives had quietly become connected. Start with hope. And for the first time in many years, I believed the garage no longer needed saving. The kindness already had. 6 months later, the sign above the garage still read, Bennett Auto Service. Nothing about the building looked dramatically different. The old wooden counter remained. The Army maintenance manuals still rested on the same shelf. Coffee still brewed before sunrise. Only one quiet addition greeted visitors near the entrance. A simple plaque. The Bennett Emergency Repair Fund. No family should lose hope because of transportation. No donor names appeared beneath it. That was intentional. The kindness belonged to the town now. Most mornings, Ethan unlocked the garage before I arrived. By the time I stepped through the service door with my coffee, he already hauled the first vehicle on the lift. He still asked questions. Lots of them. Not about engines anymore. About people. One chilly October morning, he looked up from an old pickup truck. The customer said she can only afford half. I smiled. What else did she say? He thought for a moment. Her husband starts chemotherapy next week. I nodded. What matters more? The repair. I gently shook my head. The reason. He smiled. Then he reached into his shirt pocket. Not for an invoice. For the little black notebook. He opened the final page that had once remained blank. Carefully, he wrote, Linda Foster. Fuel pump replaced. Then he paused. What comes next? I looked toward the waiting room where a frightened little boy sat beside his mother, coloring quietly with a box of worn crayons. You already know. He smiled as he finished writing. May their road become easier. He closed the notebook with the same quiet care I had used for decades. In that moment, I realized the notebook had never really belonged to me. It had simply been waiting for another pair of hands. A few weeks later, Sarah published her article. She refused to make me the headline. Instead, the title read, A Town That Learned to Keep One Another Moving. I thanked her for that. She smiled. It was never one mechanic. She looked through the garage window where Ethan was patiently explaining a repair to an elderly customer. It became a community. Every year, the Bennett Emergency Repair Fund quietly helped new families, without asking them to prove anything except genuine need. No television cameras arrived. No ribbon-cutting ceremonies followed. The work simply continued. Exactly the way quiet kindness usually does. On the first anniversary of the foreclosure hearing, I opened the notebook one final time, not to add another name, just to read. Hundreds of lives, hundreds of small prayers, hundreds of ordinary moments that had quietly become extraordinary because someone chose compassion before convenience. I handed the notebook back to Ethan. "It belongs with you now." He accepted it carefully. "I'll take good care of it." "I know." As I walked toward the garage door, the familiar sound of tools echoed behind me. For the first time in many years, I didn't feel responsible for every repair. Only grateful that the work would continue. If this story reminded you that the greatest acts of service are often the ones no one notices, I hope you'll carry that lesson into someone else's life. Sometimes helping a person keep moving forward is worth far more than anything written on an invoice. Thank you for sharing this journey. May God bless you, and may we always remember that true wealth is measured not by what we collect, but by the hope we quietly leave behind for others.